In the spring of 1962, a land agent from Prairie du Chien came to the Gruber farm in Crawford County, Wisconsin, and told Walt Gruber that the 80 acres of hardwood timber on the East Ridge was the single biggest drag on the financial performance of his operation. The agent had a yellow legal pad with numbers on it. He had calculated the opportunity cost of keeping the timber, the annual foregone income from cropland that those 80 acres could become if the ridge was cleared and the timber sold. He had calculated the going rate for hardwood saw logs that spring, black walnut at 18 cents per board foot, white oak at 12 cents. He had estimated the standing volume on the ridge at approximately 120,000 board feet. He had figured the clearing cost, the stumping cost, the seeding cost, and the time to first crop on the cleared ground. His conclusion was that Walt Gruber could realize approximately $11,400 from the timber sale, pay $4,200 to clear and prepare the ground, and begin cropping 80 acres of new ground within 2 years. At current corn yields and prices, that 80 acres would generate an additional $3,200 per year in gross crop income against what it was currently producing, which was nothing because timber doesn't produce income in the years between harvests. The agent pushed the legal pad across the kitchen table. Walt looked at it. He looked at the numbers. He said, "My father planted the walnut trees on that ridge in 1928. He paused. He said a farm with timber is never completely broke. The agent said, "With respect, that is sentiment, not economics." Walt said, "My father farmed this ground for 40 years. He said, "I am going to keep the timber." The agent drove back to Prairie du Chien. He had said the same thing, or a version of it, to 11 Crawford County farmers that spring. 7 of them had sold their timber. Walt had not sold his timber. Let me tell you about what the East Ridge was and what Walt's father had understood about it, because you need to know both things before you can understand what Walt was sitting on through 50 years of pressure to sell it. The East Ridge ran along the back of the Gruber farm the way ridges run in the Crawford County coulee country, steep-sided and wooded, the rock too close to the surface for cultivation, the slope too severe for any machinery Walt owned or was going to own. The timber on it was not a failed crop. It was what the ridge was. It had been wooded since before the Gruber family arrived in 1891, and it would be wooded after them. Walt's father Heinrich had added to it deliberately. In 1928, the year the walnut seedlings went in along the south face of the ridge, Heinrich had been thinking about what the ridge would produce in 40 years. He had been thinking about 40 years because he had read enough about black walnut to know that the trees were worth almost nothing at 10 years and worth considerably more at 40, and that the patience required to grow a walnut tree from seedling to sawlog was a specific kind of patience, the kind that skipped a generation in its payoff. He was planting trees his son would harvest. He told Walt this when Walt was old enough to understand it. He told him, "The walnut will be worth something when you are my age." He told him, "Do not cut it early, and do not sell the ridge to buy ground that will grow corn." He said, "The ridge will not grow corn. It will grow walnut. Let it do what it does." Walt had been 34 when Heinrich died in 1958. He had looked at the walnut trees on the south face of the ridge 30 years old by then, already showing the straight, tight grain of mature black walnut, and understood what his father had been saying in 1928. Now, in 1962, a land agent with a yellow legal pad was telling him the same thing in reverse. Let it do what it does, but the wrong thing. Sell the timber, clear the ridge, plant corn. Walt said no the first time in 1962. He said no the second time in 1969 when Rudy Keppler pulled up at the farm lane after selling his own woodlot and told Walt he had just put $4,800 in his pocket for trees that had been producing nothing for 20 years. He said no the third time in 1974 when the land boom made every woodlot in Crawford County look like money, sitting in the ground waiting to be converted to something more productive. 3 times. 3 different men with 3 different numbers on 3 different legal pads. Each time, Walt said, "My father's woods." Each time, the conversation ended. Let me tell you about Rudy Keppler, because you need to understand what the other path looked like before you can understand what the one path produced. Rudy had sold his woodlot in 1964, 40 acres of mixed hardwood on the ridge above his south field, for $4,800. He had taken that $4,800 and bought 12 acres of river-bottom cropland 3 miles north at $400 per acre. The 12 acres were good ground, rich loam, good drainage, accessible. In a good corn year, they produced 110 bushels per acre, which was excellent for Crawford County in the late 1960s. Rudy expanded through the 1970s the way a lot of Crawford County farmers expanded through the 1970s, buying ground when ground was available, borrowing against land values that were rising fast enough to make the debt feel manageable. By 1978, he was farming 320 acres, all cropland, all mortgaged against the land value that had made the borrowing seem rational. Then 1980 happened, and 1981, and 1982. You know what happened to land values in the farm crisis. You know what happened to corn prices. You know what happened to interest rates that had seemed manageable at 9% and became catastrophic at 21%. Rudy had 320 acres of cropland that was worth 60% of what he had paid for it and was producing corn at $1.90 per bushel against a cost of production that required $2.80 to break even. He held on through 1981 and 1982. He sold equipment in 1983. He renegotiated his operating loan in 1984. He lost 160 acres to the Crawford County Credit Association in 1985. The 160 acres he had bought last and mortgaged highest, gone to foreclosure, gone to an auction in March, with the snow still on the ground and the auctioneer calling numbers that nobody in the crowd was happy to hear. He kept 160 acres. He kept the farmhouse and the barn. But he was not the same farmer after 1985 as he had been before it, and he knew it. And everyone in Crawford County who had watched him expand through the 1970s knew it too. Walt had watched it. He had watched it the way you watch a neighbor's operation when you know what the difference was between you and you have been saying it for 20 years and you do not feel like you were proven right, because watching a neighbor lose ground is not winning. Now let me tell you about the 2 paths, because they ran side by side in Crawford County for 24 years before 1986 settled the question. Path 1, Rudy Keppler and the all-cropland operation. In every good year, And there were good years, real ones. The mid-'70s boom years when corn was above $3 and land was rising, and a man with 320 productive acres could see clearly how this was going to work out. Rudy's operation was the better-looking one. Crosse, more acres in production, higher gross income, better equipment from the higher revenue. The land agent would have called it efficient and modern and fully optimized. In the 4 years from 1982 to 1985, Rudy's all-cropland operation had nothing to sell except crops at prices that did not cover his costs. No timber to select a cut from. No walnut logs to sell when the saw log market was independent of the corn market. No fence posts to pull and sell to the neighbors who needed to fix their fences. Nothing except corn and soybeans at prices that were destroying the farms of Crawford County, one by one. Path 2. Walt Gruber and the timber. In every good year, and Walt had them too, Walt's operation was the smaller-looking one. 200 acres of cropland instead of Rudy's 320. A dairy herd that supplemented the crop income but added labor. The 80 timber acres producing nothing visible in any normal year, just standing there on the ridge, doing what ridges in Crawford County do, which is grow trees. In the farm crisis, Walt had two things Rudy did not. The first was a smaller debt load. Because he had never sold the timber to buy more cropland, he had never taken on the incremental debt that the additional cropland required. His 280 acres were bought and mostly paid for. His operating debt was manageable at the interest rates that arrived in 1980. The second was a timber harvest. In 1984, when the crop prices were at their worst and the operating accounts were running thin, Walt walked the East Ridge with a timber buyer from Crosse. He selected 32 black walnut trees from the south face, the ones Heinrich had planted in 1928, now 56 years old, with the straight, tight grain and the diameter that put them in the premium saw log category. He selected 16 white oak trees from the north slope. He selected enough red oak for 200 fence posts. The timber buyer wrote him a check for $14,800. Let me stop here and tell you what $14,800 meant in Crawford County, Wisconsin in 1984. It meant the operating loan was paid. It meant the dairy herd didn't need to be sold. It meant the machinery that was still running kept running because the repair bills could be paid. It meant Walt Gruber did not go to the Crawford County Credit Association in 1984 or 1985 or 1986 with the specific hat-in-hand posture of a man whose operation has outrun his ability to service it. It meant he kept farming. The $14,800 from 32 walnut trees and 16 white oaks and 200 fence posts kept the Gruber farm operating through the worst agricultural downturn since the Depression. Heinrich had planted those walnut trees in 1928. 56 years between the planting and the check. One generation grew them. The next generation harvested them at the moment they were needed most. Let me tell you about the mechanics of what the timber produced, because the specifics matter. Black walnut at 56 years in 1984 in Crawford County was producing saw logs in the premium veneer grade category. Logs with 12-inch plus diameter at breast height, straight grain, minimal defect. The Crosse buyer was paying 80 cents per board foot for premium walnut veneer logs. The 32 trees Walt selected averaged 180 board feet per tree. 32 trees at 180 board feet at 80 cents per board foot, $4,608 from the walnut alone. The white oak went to a furniture manufacturer in Viroqua at 35 cents per board foot. 16 trees at an average of 220 board feet, $1,232. The fence posts, red oak, split by hand on the ridge over 3 Saturdays in November, sold to 4 neighboring farms at $2.80 per post. 200 posts, $560. The remainder of the $14,800 came from a selective cut of basswood and elm for firewood, sold by the cord to town buyers in Prairie du Chien, who were converting from fuel oil to wood heat in the aftermath of the energy crises. 22 cords at $45 per cord, $990. Total from the 1984 timber harvest, $7,390 in saw logs and posts, $990 in firewood, and a specific side transaction Walt had not told the land agent about in 1962, the sale of the logging rights to the remaining standing walnut to a La Crosse veneer mill on a deferred contract, payable in 1989, when the trees reached their next grade threshold. That contract paid $6,410 in 1989. The East Ridge had not produced nothing in the years between harvests. It had been producing timber, slowly, invisibly, on a schedule that did not match the annual accounting of a crop operation, but that delivered when the delivery was needed. Have you ever watched something that looked like it was doing nothing turn out to have been doing exactly what it needed to do, in exactly the time required? Have you ever stood next to a man who sold what you kept and watched him watch you and understood that neither of you needed to say anything because the year had already said it? Walt had kept the timber because his father told him to. He had kept it 3 times against 3 arguments that were reasonable on their face. In 1984, the timber kept the farm. That was the answer to the land agent's legal pad, not the number on the pad. The farm itself, still running, still in the family, the dairy herd still in the barn, the mortgage still being serviced. Rudy Keppler drove past the Gruber farm in the spring of 1985. He saw Walt running the tractor across the creek-bottom field. He pulled over. He sat in his truck for a while. Then he drove on. He did not stop. He stopped the following spring. He got out of his truck at the farm lane. He found Walt at the machine shed. They talked about the weather. They talked about the price of milk, which was going nowhere useful. They talked about the forecast for corn. Then Rudy looked toward the East Ridge. He said, "Your father's woods are still up there." Walt said, "Still there." Rudy said, "My father had a woodlot. I sold it in '64. Walt said, "I know." Rudy looked at the ridge. He said, "I told you it was dead money." Walt said, "You did." Rudy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father would have kept it." Walt looked at the ridge. He said, "Mine said a farm with timber is never completely broke." Rudy nodded. He looked at his hands on the truck door frame. He said, "That is what mine would have said, too." He drove away. Walt stood at the machine shed and watched him go. He did not feel like he had won anything. You do not feel like you have won when you watch a man who farmed the same roads you farmed lose 160 acres to a foreclosure auction in the snow. You feel like the difference between you and him was one decision, made in a different direction, and that the decision had been made for you by a man who was dead before the consequences arrived. If you want to know what Walt did with the East Ridge after the crisis years, and what his son found when he walked the timber in 2018 and priced what was standing, subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me if your family held timber when everyone around them was selling. Walt's son David walked the East Ridge in 2018 with a timber buyer from La Crosse. The buyer was a different man than the one in 1984, but from the same company. He walked the ridge for 2 hours. He counted trees. He measured diameters. He looked at the grain on the exposed face of a blowdown from 2012, where a storm had taken 3 old white oaks and left them lying with their root plates up. He came back down to the farm lane and found David at the barn. He said, "Your grandfather planted walnut on the south face." David said, 1928. The buyer looked at his notebook. He said, "What is still standing on the south face is now 90 years old." He turned a page. The premium veneer logs on that slope are running at $4.20 per board foot. He looked up. The harvest value of the selective cut I am recommending is approximately $68,000. David looked at him. The buyer said, "I would recommend harvesting 30% of the standing volume now and scheduling the next entry for 12 years out." He looked at his notebook. The residual stand will continue to appreciate. The 12-year out harvest at projected appreciation rates will run somewhere between $90,000 and $110,000. David stood at the barn looking at the East Ridge. He thought about Heinrich in 1928 planting walnut seedlings on a south-facing slope in Crawford County because he had read that the trees were worth almost nothing at 10 years and considerably more at 40. He thought about Walt in 1962, telling the land agent it was his father's woods and watching the agent drive back to Prairie du Chien. He thought about 1984 and the check for $14,800 that had kept the farm running through the worst years. He said, "What was the walnut worth per board foot in 1984? The buyer looked in his records. He said, 80 cents for premium veneer. David said, "My grandfather planted it at nothing per board foot. My father sold some of it at 80 cents. He looked at the ridge. Now it's $4.20. The buyer said, "And the trees are 90 years old." He paused. They were not done appreciating in 1984. They are not done appreciating now. David signed the harvest contract that afternoon. He called Walt, who was 84 years old and living in Viroqua with David's mother. He told him about the $68,000 harvest estimate. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather's trees." David said, "His trees." So Walt said, "He planted them for me." He paused. "I sold some of them for the farm." He looked at whatever he was looking at in Viroqua, which was probably the window and whatever was outside it. He said, "What did you sign them for?" David told him. Walt said, "That is more than I made in 3 years of dairy in the good years." Then he said, "Don't sell the ridge." David said, "I know, Dad." Walt said, "The trees that are still standing? Don't sell the ridge. Your son will want to walk it someday." David looked at the East Ridge from the barn. His son was 11. The trees on the south face at 90 years, with the premium veneer grain that Heinrich had been thinking about in 1928, would be worth something different again in 30 years when that boy was 41 and walking the ridge with a timber buyer of his own. Let me tell you the last thing, because It is the thing Heinrich planted in 1928 and Walt kept in 1962, and the numbers have been saying ever since. Cropland produces every year, but only at the price the market is paying that year. Timber produces once every decade or two, but at a price that compounds with the age of the tree and the quality of the grain and the moment you choose to sell. A farm with both has two different production schedules and two different price exposures, and in the year when crop prices make farming impossible, the timber schedule may be the one that saves the operation. Heinrich knew this in 1928 without the vocabulary to explain it in those terms. He expressed it in two ways. He planted the walnut trees on the south face of the East Ridge, and he told Walt, a farm with timber is never completely broke. The land agent's legal pad said, sell the timber and buy cropland. The legal pad was right about what the cropland would produce. It was not right about what the timber would produce, because a legal pad calculates what something is worth in the year you are writing the numbers, and walnut trees do not become what they are worth in the year you are writing the numbers. They become what they are worth in the year your son walks the ridge with a timber buyer and hears a number that makes him call his father. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the farms that kept what compounded while everyone around them was converting to what produced this year. Of the fathers who planted for their sons and the sons who held what the fathers planted. Of the legal pads that got the math right and the answer wrong because they were written in the wrong year. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, does your farm have timber? How long has it been standing? Did anyone ever tell you to sell it? The East Ridge is still wooded. The south face still has walnut. The residuals stand from 1984, now over 100 years from Heinrich's seedlings, still appreciating, still compounding. David's son is 20 now. He has walked the ridge twice. He knows what the trees are worth. He also knows not to sell the ridge. His grandfather told his father told him, that is how the timber stays standing.